Our next speaker is Brandon Thill from University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, and he's going to present about evaluating different geologies and their suitability for brook trout habitat.
Thanks for having me. My name is Brandon. I'm a master's student at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, and I've been doing some research these past 2 years looking at suitable habitat for brook trout in the Driftless area within two different rock geologies, and that's the Sandstone and Dolostone. So just to talk a little bit about brook trout, kind of touch on some things Casey mentioned. Uh, a species we're all probably pretty familiar with. They are the only stream trout native to Wisconsin, and they're cold water specialists. So they have a thermal preference of around 22 degrees Celsius and below, and a thermal max around 25. And what this means for these fish is that as these streams might get a little warmer, some stressors can start to take place, and they're not going to want to be there anymore. And if we get to that thermal max, we can even experience things like mortality within these brook trout populations. So around the year 2019, the state of Wisconsin was projected to look something like this in terms of suitable habitat for brook trout, where the green areas are places that could sustain populations of brook trout. Now, this percentage of habitat in the state is expected to decrease 68% by the year 2050. So our state would look something like this. Now, I want to draw your attention to this map on the right, and more specifically, what's inside of this purple box. Now, here's the city of La Crosse for reference, but we see in this purple box this small pocket of green. And the question kind of becomes, why does this green spot remain here when everything else has now turned to yellow or orange or red? Well, there's a couple factors that can play into a decline in habitat that we're seeing here. So we have abiotic factors, or more environmentally based things, and biotic factors, more organismally based. On this list, we have competition, predation, insect declines, parasites like these gill lice, and infertile reproduction, such as this tiger trout here. Before touching on those abiotic factors, I want to introduce the brown trout. Brown trout are important in this equation here because they are responsible for multiple factors on this list. By far, the biggest competition for brook trout is the brown trout. They can grow larger at a faster rate and outcompete them for food resources, as well as spots within the stream. So feeding spots, resting spots, hiding spots. Brown trout eat brook trout. Brook trout also eat brook trout, but when you're adding brown trout to the equation, more of those young brook trout are being eaten. And infertile reproduction. So that tiger trout, as some of you may know, is the result of a crossing between a brown and a brook trout, and in themselves cannot successfully reproduce. So the genetic lineage of that fish is essentially ended. Continuing with brown trout a little bit, they are non-native to Wisconsin, introduced in 1887. And they do have slightly higher thermal max preferences and limits. So as these streams are getting a little warmer and the brook trout might experience some of that stress, those brown trout can persist a little longer and may have an easier time outcompeting them and pushing them out. So back to those abiotic factors, we have things like climate change, temperature variability, stream connectivity, and habitat degradation. Now, these things are all important in themselves, but when added together can really multiply the effects and damages to the streams. So onto our study area, we have seen this map on the left, and now I'm going to place a black box over our study area. And you can see in that black box, we have encompassed that small green spot. On the right is a bedrock geologic map of Wisconsin, and what it's doing is showing us the underlying bedrocks of the state. So zooming into this map, again, our study area is in this black box. To the north, we have this yellow or this sandstone region, and to the south, we have a more blue dolostone dominated region. This box here is encompassing all of Monroe County, the eastern portion of La Crosse County, and the northern half of Vernon County. And what we have observed through our studies, fish data, and personal experience is that the brook trout are more typically residing in that northern sandstone region, while our dolostone areas are more dominated by those brown trout. Another important thing to consider about our study area is how the water is entering our stream. So to the north in the sandstone region, our streams are more influenced by a groundwater inflow, while the dolostone streams are more dominated by springs. Now, springs are good. They're a good input of cold, clean water. However, they tend to be localized within the stream, and several springs, maybe one here, maybe one 100 yards down. Whereas that groundwater inflow provides a constant influx of water throughout the whole majority of the stream bed, providing a more stable environment. So here is a map of all of our study sites. We had 20 in total, 11 sandstone streams to the north and 9 dolostone streams to the south. Some sandstone streams included Big Creek, Burns Creek, and Coles Valley, while to the south we had some more well-known streams such as Rulin's Coulee, Timber Coulee, Coon Creek, as well as Mapledale and Seas Branch, some of those brook trout restoration sites. So comparing these two streams side by side, I would like to point out a few differences. The first thing is the composition of the stream bed. So our dolostone streams are more typically composed of rock, so some cobble, gravel, and they also have a larger abundance of macrophytes or aquatic vegetation. Comparing that to our sandstone streams on the right, we can see, hence the name, there's a lot of sand. The majority of the substrates in these sandstone streams was sand. The next thing I'd like to point out is the riparian areas surrounding the streams. So our dolostone streams tended to run through pasture, agriculture, and places with low canopy. Where we see in the sandstone streams, we have that high tree and shrub canopy, which provides a lot of shade to the stream and ultimately helps keep it a little cooler. Now, the last thing I'd like to point out, which is difficult to see in these two pictures, is the lack of channel units we observed in our sandstone streams. So the majority of these streams were one long, big run, relatively deep, relatively slow moving water. Compared that to our dolostone streams, we had those pool riffle run complexes that we might be a little more used to, where our sandstone streams were lacking those. Diving deeper into each of these different regions, our sandstone streams showed a little bit lower productivity, were a little less basic, and in the sandstone region of our study area, 66% of it was forested, while 24% was agricultural cover. Shifting to the dolostone, these streams had higher productivity. They had that harder, rockier stream bottom. And we see some roles reversed here, where our forest cover is now around 28%, and the agricultural cover is taking up around 62%. And these two pictures here are a good representation of those riffles, those shallow, fast-moving water over rocks that we did not see in the sandstone streams. The last thing I want to point out about our study area here is the soil infiltration rates. So in our sandstone watershed on the left here, the soils were highly influenced by this high infiltration soil, that sandier soil. So any water coming, hitting the ground is having an easier time infiltrating the surface and percolating down into the groundwater source. Whereas we see in our dolostone watershed here on the right, we have a much higher influence of moderate and slow infiltration soils. So that water is having a harder time penetrating the surface. Now, we can pair this more moderate and slow infiltration soil with that added agriculture, and one could suggest that the water is having an easier time flowing off the surface through those fields and picking up excess nutrients and chemicals and directly inputting them into the stream. So my overall objectives for my master's research project were to quantify brook and brown trout habitat in Monroe and Vernon counties, to assess the influence of geology, land use, and soil composition, and to determine which variables are having the strongest correlation to summer stream temperatures. And we know that stream temperature is important for these trout. Excuse me. We also know that last summer was hot and it was dry. And this can have really damaging effects on the streams by increasing water temperatures, increasing vegetation growth, and lowering water levels. This can also have effects on the fish. So directly, temperature can change the rates of metabolism in the fish. It can change their overall willingness to grow. Overall willingness to feed and their overall ability to grow. Indirectly, temperature can influence prey availability and mediate competitive interactions. So as those streams are getting a little warmer, those brown trout are having an easier time outcompeting the brook trout. So what we did is place temperature loggers in 10 streams, and they were set to record every 15 minutes from the months of July through August. And here's what that looked like. So this graph here is showing our two highest discharge streams in the Sandstone and Dolostone region. So our sandstone is going to be the blue line on the bottom there, and our dolostone is the orange on the top. And we can see that there's very little overlap between these two streams, and that our sandstone stream is ultimately remaining cooler than that dolostone stream. And what I can do here is add that 22-degree and 25-degree thermal preference and thermal limit for the brook trout. And now it becomes really apparent how often that dolostone stream is approaching, if not crossing, that preference limit. Even looking to late August there, when we had air temperatures of around 106 degrees, we can see that dolostone stream getting really close to that 25-degree thermal max. This next graph here is our two lowest discharge streams, or our two smallest streams. And again, the sandstone will be blue and dolostone will be orange. What we see here is a lot of overlap. And ultimately, our dolostone stream is getting warmer and cooler than the sandstone stream. Our sandstone stream is remaining relatively constant and stable, whereas this variability in itself that we see in the dolostone can cause harm to the fish. So going from hot to cold day to day can provide lots of stress on the fish themselves, where this sandstone stream is providing a more stable and constant environment. And again, I can put that 22 and 25-degree limit there. And we see how often that dolostone stream is getting up there. So aside from temperature, we also did habitat modeling. And we did this for each of our 20 sites. So each of our sites needed a stream reach, and the stream reach was classified as 30 times the mean stream width, with a minimum of 150 meters. So if my stream was on average 5 meters wide or less, the stream reach that we measured would automatically be 150 meters long. Each reach was then divided into 31 transects, and each of those transects or cross sections were spaced 1 mean stream width apart. So for my 150 meter long reach, each of my transects would be spaced 5 meters apart. Now this was the case for 18 of our 20 streams. So I'll continue on with this 150 meter example. At each of those transects, we measured 4 points: the left, the middle, and the right, as well as the thaw wag. So the thaw wag is typically known as the deepest, fastest part of the stream and is variable. So it could have been here, it could have been all the way here on the right, or it could have been all the way here on the left. It's something we visually estimated. So at each of these points, we measured 8 variables, and they included stream depth, average current velocity, bottom current velocity, distance to cover, type of cover, if riparian shade was of influence, if we were embedded at that point, and the overall substrate composition of that point. So here I've provided a couple pictures. On the left is our reach tape spanning that 150 meters. And on the right, we see the transect tape going perpendicular to the stream, which we used to measure out our left, middle, and right. Now for each reach and all 31 transects at each reach, all 4 points at each transect, and all 8 variables at each point, we ended up with something that looked like this, and this, and this, and this. So this is one stream's worth of data, and it's a lot to look at. It's kind of overwhelming, but that's the point. We have all of this data, and we can now numerically paint a picture of this stream and see what habitats are available in these brook trout dominated and brown trout dominated streams. And ultimately, how are these variables influencing temperature during the summer in these streams? So now we can take a look at a little bit of data. Shown here are depth by geology type and average current velocity by geology type. So what we can pull from this is that overall, our sandstone streams are deeper and a little slower than our dolostone streams. Now, one could hypothesize that this is due to the lack of riffles that we're seeing in the dolostone streams, that shallow, fast-moving water, which is making these sandstone streams deeper and slower. Next is substrate compositions. So both of our regions here, we can see, to be expected, a very high influence of sand in our sandstone streams, whereas our dolostone is more dominated by that cobble and gravel. And if we look at boulder, silt, and debris, it's remaining relatively constant amongst the two areas. So getting more into some nitty-gritty data here, this is a correlation matrix. And what it's doing is comparing variables of stream sites together to look for any relationship. Now I want to draw your attention to one point in particular, and that's mean temperature and basin area. So we tend to think larger stream, warmer temperature, or smaller stream, colder temperature. But with this value here of about 0.1, pretty close to 0, we're not seeing that. So we're not seeing a direct relationship between size of stream and overall temperature. Our next piece of data here are AIC models. Now, what these do is run a bunch of models with all of our variables and pull out the most influential variables for a response variable that I have chosen. So on the left is I used mean stream temperature as a response variable. And what this has given me is that mean depth, geology type, and conductivity have the most influence or are holding the highest weight towards determining the mean temperature of a stream. Now, conductivity is a product of geology type. They were vastly different between the two regions, but it threw it in there. So over on the right, instead for my response variable, I now have mean temperature range. So how hot and how cold that stream is getting day to day. And now we're seeing that embeddedness and conductivity are the two variables that are having the highest influence on mean temperature range in these streams. Lastly is a principal component analysis. And now what this is doing is separating our sites based on the value of different variables. So if we look at this PC1 axis or this x-axis, it's showing us a difference in geology type, where we have all of our dolostone sites here on the right and all of our sandstone sites here on the left. And we're seeing negative relationships between things like percent forest and percent high infiltration soil versus percent rock, gravel, and conductivity there in the back. On our PC2 axis or our y-axis, it is demonstrating a difference in stream size. So here we're seeing negative relationships between things like depth, basin area, and current velocity versus how much of the stream is shaded and average distance to cover. So moving on, this summer I also performed some snorkel surveys in these streams. And essentially this was for me to observe fish positions doing one of two activities, and that was either resting or feeding. Now, fish were deemed resting if they were on the bottom and feeding if they were suspended. And when I found them, I placed a bright orange painted rock, as you can see in this top picture, in their location, which we then used to take those same habitat variables. Now, what we've seen is that resting fish were observed tucked away in spots of refuge, perhaps overhead banks, behind large boulders, or under large woody debris. Whereas feeding fish, as some trout anglers might expect, we observed behind in spots of refuge next to fast moving water where they could easily dart out and catch anything drifting by. Now, I have yet to analyze this data, but what it's going to do is give me specifics about this in-stream fish position and what's making this spot in the stream so good for resting, or this spot so good for feeding. We'll be able to determine the use of these specific habitats in the stream. So in conclusion, brook trout habitat is declining. This is due to things like climate change and competitive interactions. But habitat modeling and snorkel surveys can allow us to see the bigger picture. We know that cool water temperatures are essential for these brook trout, and there are several variables that are playing a big role in summer stream temperatures in this study area. So perhaps conservation maps and possibly brook trout reserves could help us to identify places and habitats of ecological importance to help protect and conserve the brook trout in the Driftless area.
Brandon, thank you so much. Very interesting presentation.